Welcome back. Now we go into the actual sutra texts here that are in this particular chapter. The first section within that deals with old age, illness, and death, and the first one is specifically about aging and death. So I'm going to just highlight certain pieces of each of these as we go through. I encourage you, please, if you've not already done so, to read each of these and get a more complete idea of what it is that is being referred to as a part of this. So here he's being addressed by the king of Koshala, and he is asked about this. He asks, is anyone who is born free from aging and death? And so he responds, that is, the Buddha responds, no one who is born is free from aging and death. Because they have been born, they are not free from aging and death. Even those affluent Brahmins are not free from aging and death. Even those monks who are arhats and are completely liberated through final knowledge, this body is subject to breaking up, subject to being laid down. So it doesn't matter what your status is in society or anything else, we're all going to die at some point. Some die at very young ages, some die at much older ages. Next we have the simile of the mountain, and here we have King Pasenadi, and he pays homage to the Buddha, sat down, and then the Buddha asked him, "Now, where are you coming from, great king, in the middle of the day?" So the king is asking, and this is another style that we see on behalf by the Buddha in engaging other people, by asking them questions. And so he responds. It says he's been dealing with the affairs of kingship, the intoxication with sovereignty, and being obsessed by greed for sense pleasures and control and ruling over the country and so forth. "What do you think, great king?" the Buddha replies. "Then suppose a man would come to you from the east, one who is trustworthy and reliable, and would tell you, 'I am coming from the east. I saw a great mountain high as the clouds coming this way, crushing all living beings. Do whatever you think should be done.' And then another from the west comes and repeats the same story, and then a third from the north, and then a fourth from the south." So from all directions we have people coming, and these great mountains are coming and crushing all beings. And these are said to be reliable people, trustworthy people, so we shouldn't doubt the things that they are saying. But what then should be done? It could result in terrible destruction, the human state being so difficult to obtain. What can be done, he asks. And so, excuse me. What else should be done but to live by the Dharma, to live righteously, and to do wholesome and meritorious deeds? And so he says to the king, "Aging and death are rolling in on you, great king. What should be done?" And so he repeats, live by the Dharma, live righteously, do wholesome and meritorious deeds. So he's kind of asking in the way that he's stating it. And then he says, "Venerable sir, kings intoxicated with the intoxication of sovereignty, greed for sense pleasures, control of their country, and ruling over the territory, conquer by means of various battles, but there is no hope of victory for such battles when aging and death are rolling in." And then he says there is no hope of victory by wealth. "What else should I do but live by the Dharma, live righteously, and do wholesome and meritorious deeds?" "So it is, great king," he responds to him. And so the king is coming up with the answers himself, and the Buddha is just reinforcing these answers in this case. And then there's a series of verses at the end of this particular sutra. So I just wanted to read through the last two of these because there's a lot of repetition in this. Therefore, a person of wisdom here, out of regard for his own good, steadfast should settle faith in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. When one conducts oneself by Dhamma, the body, speech, and mind, they praise one here in the present life, and after death one rejoices in heaven. Although heaven's not a word that is typically used by the Buddha here, but we'll leave that alone for now. Then we have this set of what are referred to as the divine messengers here. There are monks, 3 divine messengers. What 3? There is a person of bad conduct in body, speech, and mind. After death, he is reborn in misery in hell. Take him before Yama. And King Yama then questions that man, addresses him, "Didn't you ever see the first divine messenger appearing among humankind?" "No, Lord, I did not see him," he replies. Yama then says, "A woman or a man, old, frail, bent, ailing, no youth or vigor, all those are gone?" And he replies, "Yes, Lord, I have seen this." And so Yama continues, "Didn't it ever occur to you, I am too subject to old age and cannot escape it. Let me now do noble deeds by body, speech, and mind?" "No, Lord, I could not do it. I was negligent." So then Yama says, "Through negligence you have failed to do noble deeds by body, speech, and mind. You will be treated as befits your negligence." So it's all up to us. Nobody else can do it for us, is the point that we're making here. You alone have done that evil deed, and you will have to experience the fruit. And then Yama goes on and questions the man about a second one, saying, "Did you ever see the second divine messenger appearing among humankind?" And he responds, "No, Lord, I did not see him." "But, my good man, didn't you ever see a woman or a man who was sick, in pain, seriously ill, lying in his own filth, having to be lifted up by some and put to bed by others?" He responds, "Yes, Lord, I have seen that." Well, we don't have quite as many experiences of that kind of thing in our society. We tend to hide those things away, for one thing, but we also live in a culture and a society where there just aren't as many of those kind of things visible as there would have been in India at the age and time of the Buddha. But then he goes on, "Didn't it ever occur to you, I too am subject to illness and cannot escape it. Let me now do noble deeds by body, speech, and mind." "No, Lord, I could not do it. I was negligent." You have failed to do noble deeds by body, speech, and mind. You alone have done that evil deed, and you will have to experience the fruit. And then Yama goes on, he again questions the man about the third one, saying, "Didn't you ever see the third divine messenger appearing among humankind?" "No, Lord, I did not see him." "Didn't you ever see a woman or a man 1, 2, or 3 days dead, the corpse swollen, discolored, and festering?" "Yes, Lord, I have seen this." "Didn't it ever occur to you, I too am subject to death and cannot escape it. Let me now do noble deeds by body, speech, and mind?" "No, Lord, I could not do it. I was negligent." You have failed to do noble deeds by body, speech, and mind. You will be treated as befits your negligence. You alone have done that evil deed, and you will have to experience the fruit. So we have the responsibility ourselves. It's up to us as individuals to address these issues. And of course the messengers there are not beings per se, but they are events. They are things going on that we may see or not see in our life. And maybe you won't see a dead body somewhere. Not everybody experiences that, but sometimes we see friends or family or something like that after they have died. Some people will actually find a loved one or other individual as a part of that. And it can be a fairly traumatic kind of an experience if we're not prepared for that. But it's still our responsibility to use the message that's being sent to us, to remember that we too must die in that particular example. So it's up to us to take advantage of the path that has been brought to us by the Buddha and to follow that path and to do good deeds and so forth with body, speech, and mind. So that's the message being given to us here. The second topic are the tribulations of unreflective living. So not thinking about our lives very much. I guess you can carry that over from the previous one, but the focus is a little bit different here. So the first sutra here is the dart of painful feeling. So in this one we're talking about the physical pain and the mental anguish associated with that pain. Monks, when the uninstructed worldling, so here's that term about the one who has not received the teachings on the Dharma, when this person experiences a painful feeling, he sorrows, grieves, and laments. He weeps, beating his breast, and becomes distraught. He feels two feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. Suppose they were to strike a man with a dart and then a second dart. So too he feels two feelings, a bodily one and a mental one. So this is setting up the example that he wants to use here to illustrate this point. So then he goes on, while experiencing that same painful feeling, he harbors aversion toward it. I don't like the feeling. He seeks delight in sensual pleasures. Why? Because the uninstructed worldling does not know of any escape from painful feeling other than sensual pleasure. Okay, so we don't have another alternative, so that is what we look for. Lust for pleasant feeling lies behind this. He does not understand the underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling that lies behind this. So we can have different kinds of feelings as a part of this. We can have an aversion, or it can be a more neutral kind of feeling. If he feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it attached. And then if he feels a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he feels it attached. Attached to birth, aging, and death. Attached to sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair. Who is attached to suffering? Monks, when the instructed noble disciple, so now we're shifting gears here to the noble instructed disciple, someone who has received the Dharma teachings, this person experiences a painful feeling. So it's the same. If you hit your thumb with a hammer, you're going to experience that even if you're in an enlightened state. He does not, however, sorrow, grieve, or lament. He does not weep, beating his breast, and become distraught. He feels one feeling, a bodily one, not a mental one. So the dart example here, the man would feel a feeling caused by one dart only. He harbors no aversion to this. The underlying tendency to aversion does not lie behind this. He does not seek delight in sensual pleasure. He knows of an escape from the painful feeling other than sensual pleasure. So there is an alternative, a different way out, and he knows and understands that. Lust for pleasant feeling does not lie behind this. It really is the origin and passing away. Things come and they go. Eventually the pain in the thumb is going to disappear. The underlying tendency to ignorance in regard to neither painful nor pleasant feeling does not lie behind this. If he feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it detached. If he feels a painful feeling, he feels it detached. If he feels a neither painful nor pleasant feeling, he feels it detached. Detached from birth, aging, and death. Detached from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair. Detached from suffering, I say. This, monks, is the difference between the instructed noble disciple and the uninstructed worldling. So making that difference between one who has had that understanding, training of the mind, and so that makes a difference in the way that we see the world, the way we understand the world, then the way the world affects us. It affects us in a different way. A mental way is different. The second story here is the vicissitudes of life, the unwelcome changes, if you will. And here he's talking about the 8 worldly conditions that we mentioned before. So these are what keep the world turning around. What 8 are these? He mentions them: the gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain. So these are encountered by an uninstructed worldling, so we're using that term again, and an instructed noble disciple. So we're making that same kind of a comparison here. So what is the distinction, he asks? When an uninstructed worldling comes upon gain, he does not reflect on it thus: this gain that has come to me is impermanent, bound up with suffering, subject to change. He does not know it as it really is. And when he comes upon loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, with such a person, gain and loss, fame, disrepute, praise and blame, pleasure and pain keep his mind engrossed. When gain comes, he is elated, and when loss, he is dejected. When fame comes, he is elated, and with disrepute, he is dejected. In praise, he is elated. With blame, he is dejected. With pleasure, he is elated, and in pain, he is dejected. Being thus involved in likes and dislikes, he will not be free from birth, aging, and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair. He will not be freed from suffering. So it makes a clear distinction between the two here, and then he goes on more specifically about the instructed noble disciple. When that individual comes upon gain, then he recognizes that it is impermanent, bound up with suffering, and subject to change. When he encounters loss, views that as they really are, they do not engross his mind. And he will not be elated by gain, dejected by loss, elated by fame, dejected by disrepute, elated by praise, dejected by blame, elated by pleasure, dejected by pain. So these things do not affect the instructed noble disciple in that way. Having given up likes and dislikes, freed from birth, aging, and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair, you will be freed from suffering or discontent or dissatisfaction and so forth. Then we go on to the next sutra, anxiety due to change. Monks, I will teach you agitation through clinging and non-agitation through non-clinging. And how, monks, is there agitation through clinging? In the case of the uninstructed worldling, he would regard form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. Sound a little bit familiar with the Heart Sutra? That form of his changes and alters. His consciousness becomes preoccupied with the change of form. Agitation and mental states born of preoccupation with the change, obsessing his mind, Because his mind is obsessed, he is frightened, distressed, and anxious, and through clinging he becomes agitated. He regards feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as if or as in self, or self as in consciousness. This is a point where he's injected some of these ellipses, the ... that are in there, to eliminate some of the repetition that are in the sutras here. There's still some that he includes to help us get a flavor for it, but it becomes less redundant in trying to read these when eliminating a little bit of that. And then he continues, consciousness is of his changes and alters. That consciousness of his changes and alters. It becomes preoccupied with the change of consciousness, agitation and preoccupation with the change of consciousness, obsessing his mind. Because his mind is obsessed, he is frightened and distressed and anxious and becomes agitated. And it is in this way, monks, that there is agitation through clinging. And then how, monks, is there non-agitation through non-clinging? So making the comparison. So here we have the instructed noble disciple, one who has learned the Dharma, is skilled and disciplined in the Dharma. This one does not regard form as self, or self as possessing form, or form as in self, or self as in form. Form changes and alters. His consciousness does not become preoccupied with change of form. No agitation in mental states born of preoccupation with the change remain obsessing his mind. Because his mind is not obsessed, he is not frightened, distressed, or anxious, and through non-clinging he does not become agitated. He does not regard feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self, or self as possessing consciousness, or consciousness as in self, or self as in consciousness. That consciousness of his changes and alters. It does not become preoccupied with the change of consciousness. There is no agitation, and mental states born of preoccupation with the change of consciousness remain obsessing his consciousness. Because his mind is not obsessed, he is not frightened, distressed, or anxious. And through non-clinging, he does not become agitated. And the language there is a little bit difficult to manipulate your way through, but we get the idea here between the two extremes of the individual who does not have the training and the one who does, and the various forms of things where we become agitated, our mind gets focused on those issues and we become obsessed with those, as opposed to one who is trained to recognize that our mind is going to change. It will change by itself with nothing that we really need to do as a part of that, but just let go and let be. The third section here then is a world in turmoil. All of this stuff going on. And the first one is called the origin of conflict. Where does all of this come from? Why is it, and speaking to the master Kachana, that Katyas fight with Katyas, Brahmins with Brahmins, householders with householders? Because of attachment to sensual pleasures, fixation on sensual pleasures, addiction to sensual pleasures, obsession with sensual pleasures, holding firmly to sensual pleasures. You begin to get the idea. That's kind of a big issue with the Buddha. These sensual pleasures that we have, this fixation on them and getting addicted to these kind of things. Now, he teaches us a middle way. It's not that it's one extreme or the other. It's somewhere in between. So he's not saying that we have to just totally get rid of all sensual pleasures. That's not the message that we're getting from the Buddha. But we need to get rid of the extreme kinds of attachment and aversions that we have to various things. And usually with sensual pleasures, it's the attachment aspect. Why is it that ascetics fight with ascetics? Attachment to views, adherence to views, fixation on views, addiction to views, obsession with views, holding firmly to views. So with the ascetics, remember he did the practice of the ascetic practices for a period of 6 years early in his process of becoming a Buddha as well, so was intimately familiar with those. And here he's saying that they're just obsessed about something a little bit differently than what the Brahmins are focused on the views. Okay? But it's still the same types of experiences that are creating the problem there. The second one is, why do beings live in hate? And here the Saka, the ruler of the Devas, asked the Blessed One, beings wish to live without hate, harming, hostility, or enmity. They wish to live in peace. Yet they live in hate, harming one another, hostile and as enemies. By what fetters are they bound that they live in such a way? And so the Buddha replies here then, it is the bonds of envy and niggardliness, that stinginess, that bind beings. Saka was delighted and exclaimed, so it is, Blessed One, I have overcome my doubt and gotten rid of uncertainty. So he was convinced. Then he asked another question, what gives rise to envy and niggardliness? The Buddha responds, envy and niggardliness arise from liking and disliking, making judgments about things. So whenever we put things into categories like that, liking or disliking, it's because we're making judgments about them rather than just seeing them as they are. What gives rise to liking and disliking? They arise from desire. And what gives rise to desire? It arises from thinking. So it all starts with our mind. It's how we've trained our mind to envision things, to understand things. When the mind thinks about something, desire arises. When mind thinks of nothing, desire does not arise. What gives rise to thinking? Thinking arises from elaborated perceptions and notions or biases that we have developed as a part of that thinking. So because we have biases towards certain things against other things, attachment and aversion, that's what gives rise to the kind of things that create all of these problems that we have. The third sutra included here is the dark chain of causation. So here we wind up with a list of things. One thing leads to another. Here he's talking to Ananda, his personal assistant. Thus, Ananda, in dependence upon feeling, there is craving. In dependence upon craving, there is pursuit. In dependence upon pursuit, there is gain. In dependence upon gain, there is decision-making. In dependence upon decision-making, there is desire and lust. In dependence upon desire and lust, there is attachment. In dependence upon attachment, there is possessiveness. In dependence upon possessiveness, there is niggardliness. In dependence upon niggardliness, there is defensiveness. And because of defensiveness, various evil, unwholesome things originate. The taking of clubs and weapons, conflicts, quarrels and disputes, insults, slander, and falsehood. So there he shows, first of all, the sequence of things, the way one thing builds on another, and that there are then consequences of the actions that we take as a result of those things. So the principle is fairly simple. It's not necessarily that it's one particular way these things happen. They can happen in a variety of ways, but the fact is that they do happen if we're not careful about how we view things and understand things. The fourth one is the roots of violence and oppression. Where do those come from? And here he's talking primarily about the three poisons. Greed, hatred, and delusion of every kind are unwholesome. Action by deeds, words, or thoughts is unwholesome. Overpowered by greed, hatred, and delusion, thoughts inflict under false pretexts killing, imprisonment, confiscation of property, false accusations or expulsion, and being prompted by the thought, I have power, I want power. All this is unwholesome too. Then there's another one here. Oh, this is the fourth category, without discoverable beginning. Okay, so here we're talking about beginningless time, basically. The first example that he gets is called grass and sticks, which are among the things that are referred to here. And he uses in this the phrase first point. What he's referring to is the starting point, the beginning. Monks, this samsara is without discoverable beginning. A first point is not discerned. The starting point is not discerned of beings roaming and wandering on, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. Suppose, monks, a man would cut up whatever grass, sticks, branches, and foliage there is in this subcontinent of India, and collect them together into a single heap. Having done so, he would put them down, saying for each one, this is my mother, this is my mother's mother. So he's taking from this huge pile of things, all of these things from all of the subcontinent of India. So a fairly large, especially in the humid areas where lush growth, much lush growth. You're taking one little piece at a time and you're setting it down and you're going back to this mother and the mother's mother and the mother's mother before that and so forth. The sequence of that man's mothers and grandmothers would not come to an end, yet the grass, sticks, branches, and foliage of this would be used up and exhausted. So this huge pile is going to go away before we get to the end, going back and back and back. Why? Because this samsara is without discoverable beginning. A first point is not discerned of beings roaming and wandering on, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. For such a long time, monks, you have experienced suffering, anguish, and disaster, and swelled the cemetery. So this is going through this cycle of rebirth in samsara. It is enough to become disenchanted with all the formations, enough to become dispassionate toward them, enough to be liberated from them. So we see this going on, and we see this beginningless time, and having recycled through this over and over and over, then that should be enough to cause us to think about what we have done, what we are doing, and change our outlook on these things. Specifically, he says, become disenchanted, dispassionate, and liberated from them. And then he has another one in here, which is called balls of clay, in which little balls of clay are made from the earth. So if we took all of the clay, took all of the earth from the planet and made little balls out of it, and then we go through basically the same kind of a process as in the previous one. We take each one, the mother, the mother's mother, and so forth, back through time. We would use up all of those clay balls before we ever got to the beginning of time as a part of that. So I won't go through the details of that one because it's essentially the same. So the third one here is referred to as the mountain. A certain monk approached the Blessed One, paid homage, sat down, and said, "Venerable Sir, how long is an eon?" An eon is long, monk. It is not easy to count it. So he's basically saying, well, it's just a really, really long time. And so he asked, is it possible to give a simile, Venerable Sir? So then he comes up with an example here. Suppose there was a great stone mountain, Johanna long, and so Johanna is about 7 miles. So a great stone mountain, 7 miles long, 7 miles wide, 7 miles high, without holes or crevices. So it's just this huge solid stone. One solid mass of rock. At the end of every 100 years, a man would take a stroke They'd stroke it once with a piece of fine cloth. The great stone mountain might by this effort be worn away and eliminated by the eon, but the eon would still not have come to an end. So even just brushing it with a fine piece of cloth once every 100 years, which eventually it would wear away, but even that is not as long as an eon. So we have wandered through so many eons, hundreds of eons, thousands, hundreds of thousands. This samsara is without discoverable beginning. It is enough to be liberated from them. So this is the wish for liberation, that we would attain liberation and no longer have to go through these eons of cycles of rebirth. The next one is similar, but relating to the river Ganges. Here, talking with a Brahmin who asked Master Gautama, how many eons have elapsed and gone by? Many eons have elapsed and gone by. It is not easy to count them. Give a simile, please. And so he gives one, but this time he gives the simile of the length of the Ganges River, and I'm not sure how long that is. I would guess over thousands of miles. It's a very long river. And he says all the grains of sand from the beginning of the river up until the very end of the river. If you took those and at the point between where it originates and the point where it enters the great ocean, it's not easy to count all of those. But those two, counting all of those, would be less than an eon. And there are eons that just go on and on and on. So very similar to the mountain example. And then finally we have the dog on a leash. Monks, this samsara is without discoverable beginning. At first it is not discerned. When the great ocean dries up and evaporates and no longer exists, there is no making an end of suffering for those beings roaming and wandering on, hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. There comes a time, monks, when Sinnaru, the king of mountains, burns up and perishes and no longer exists. Still, there is no making of the end of suffering. There comes a time when the great earth burns up. Suppose a dog tied on a leash was bound to a strong post or pillar. It would just keep running and revolving around that same post or pillar. So too, the uninstructed worldling regards form as self, feeling as self, perception as self, volitional formations as self, consciousness as self. He just keeps running and revolving around those: form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, the five aggregates. As he keeps on running, he is not freed. He is not freed from birth, aging, and death, not freed from sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair, not freed from suffering, I say. So all of these things, we just keep running in circles like the dog running around this pillar. And so presumably he's connected in a way that it doesn't connect, or the dog eventually is going to run into the pillar. You've probably seen dogs actually do something like that, run around a pole, never turning around, going the other way, and eventually get caught by that. But the idea is that this would not happen. It can continue to run around just like samsara continues to run around. And we do not overcome all of those kinds of things that lead to our own dissatisfaction, our own discontent, our own suffering as a part of that. So in order to overcome that, we need to change what we do, how we see things, how we understand things. So by doing the practices on the path, we can achieve that. And in many cases, and we'll see some of this later on, I believe, the Buddha talked about the fact that it could be achieved in this lifetime. So that is where we are for today. Next week we'll take up chapter 2 in this book, The Bringer of Light.